I'm Isabella Sandberry, 32 years old, and I built my career serving in the force, protecting information most people never even knew existed. For years, I carried my family, especially my younger brother James, covering for him, funding him, defending him whenever he stumbled. But the night I came home from a mission and overheard him laughing with my parents about selling my classified files for cash, everything changed. Have you ever been betrayed by the very people you trusted most? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being used or betrayed, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. Because what happened next might shock you. I grew up believing that family meant everything. My parents drilled this into me from the moment I could understand words, their voices carrying that particular weight parents use when they're teaching you something they consider fundamental. Family comes first, always, my mother would say, usually while I was helping my younger brother James with homework he should have been doing himself. Our house ran on discipline and appearances. My father, a career accountant, kept schedules posted on the refrigerator and expected us to follow them. My mother managed our social calendar like a military operation, ensuring we attended every school function, every neighborhood gathering, every church service that might reflect well on our family's reputation. They valued achievement, but more than that, they valued the image of achievement. James was different from the start. Where I followed rules, he bent them. Where I earned praise through effort, he charmed his way out of consequences. He had this way of tilting his head and smiling that made adults melt, that made teachers give him extensions, that made our parents excuse behavior they never would have tolerated from me. Boys will be boys, my mother would say when he came home with torn clothes and stories that didn't quite add up. He's just spirited. I became his handler without anyone officially appointing me to the role. In elementary school, I walked him to class when he was late, which was most days. I helped him with projects the night before they were due, staying up past midnight to make sure he had something to turn in. I covered for him when he skipped detention, telling our parents he was at study group with me. It felt natural, protective. He was my little brother, and protecting him felt like love. The pattern continued through high school. James discovered he could make people laugh, that humor could deflect almost any criticism. He developed a reputation as the funny kid, the one who could talk his way out of anything. Teachers liked him despite his mediocre grades. Girls found his carelessness charming. He floated through assignments and social situations with an ease I envied, even as I was the one making sure he graduated. I paid for his SAT prep course with money from my part-time job. I proofread his college applications, essentially rewriting them. When he got into state school on a combination of my edited essays and my parents' connections, everyone celebrated his success. I felt proud and resentful in equal measure, a contradiction I couldn't name at 17. College separated us physically but not functionally. He called when he needed money, which was often. Just until my next student loan disbursement, he'd say, and I'd transfer funds from my carefully managed account to his perpetually overdrawn one. He called when he was failing classes, and I'd spend hours on the phone helping him navigate academic probation. He called when he was homesick or heartbroken or just bored, and I listened because that's what big sisters do. Meanwhile, I was building something different. I'd always been drawn to structure, to purpose, to the idea that some things were bigger than personal convenience. I studied international relations, then applied to join the intelligence community. The background check process was exhaustive, but I had nothing to hide. My life was documented, orderly, intentional. Basic training was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere completely. The precision, the teamwork, the sense of serving something beyond myself, it all clicked. I excelled in ways that surprised even me. My instructors noticed my attention to detail, my ability to compartmentalize information, my natural discretion. They recommended me for specialized training, then for assignments that required security clearance. I wrote home regularly, carefully editing out anything classified while trying to convey that I was thriving. My parents were proud but distant, as if my success existed in a foreign language they couldn't quite speak. James's responses to my letters were brief, usually asking for money or making jokes about my soldier life that felt less affectionate as time went on. During my first deployment, maintaining family connection became harder but more important to me. I called when I could, sent packages during holidays, remembered birthdays. I wanted them to know that distance and secrecy hadn't changed my loyalty. I was still their daughter, their sister, even if I couldn't tell them exactly where I was or what I was doing. The dynamic felt familiar even from thousands of miles away. I gave support, financial, emotional, practical. They took it as their due. James continued drifting between jobs and relationships, never quite landing anywhere stable. My parents continued making excuses, smoothing his path, minimizing his failures as temporary setbacks. I told myself this was normal family functioning. I was the responsible one, so I carried responsibility. James was the free spirit, so he got freedom. My parents loved us both, just differently. The imbalance was simply how our roles had evolved, nothing more complex or troubling than birth order and personality. But even then, I noticed small changes in how James talked to me. The admiration he'd shown as a kid, the way he used to brag about his big sister to his friends, had faded. Now he seemed almost irritated by my calls, impatient with my questions about his life. When I mentioned my work, even in the vaguest terms, he'd change the subject or make comments about how secretive I'd become, how I thought I was better than everyone else. "You've gotten so serious," he told me during one phone call, and there was an edge in his voice I didn't recognize. "It's like you don't trust anyone anymore." I laughed it off, but his words bothered me. Trust had nothing to do with security protocols. I trusted my family completely, maybe more than I should have. Looking back now, I can see how naive that trust was, how it blinded me to what was growing in the spaces between us. I thought love and loyalty were the same thing. I thought protection meant shielding someone from consequences, even when those consequences might teach necessary lessons. I thought being needed was the same as being valued. I was wrong about all of it, but I wouldn't learn that until much later, until the night I came home and heard my brother's voice through our parents' window, laughing about secrets and betrayal as if they were the best joke he'd ever told. The distance I felt wasn't geographic. It was the gap between who I thought we were and who we actually were, widening with each deployment, each phone call, each time I sent money or made excuses or convinced myself that this was just how families worked. I was still trying to protect him, even as he was learning to see my protection as something to exploit rather than treasure. But I didn't know that yet. I still believed in the story I'd been telling myself since childhood, that we were a family, that family meant loyalty, and that loyalty meant never questioning whether the people you love deserve your trust. The first rail warning came during my second deployment, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. I'd been overseas for 6 months, working on classified operations that required complete focus and discretion. The work was demanding but rewarding, the kind of assignment that could define a career if handled well. James had been avoiding my calls. When I finally reached him, his voice carried a distance that had nothing to do with the satellite connection. He seemed distracted, dismissive. When I asked about his job search, he gave vague answers about opportunities and connections that sounded unlike his usual aimless optimism. "You wouldn't understand," he said when I pressed for details. "Your life is all rules and regulations. Some of us have to think outside the box." My parents started echoing strange comments during our weekly calls. Little things at first, observations that felt slightly off. "James says you've become very secretive," my mother mentioned, her tone carefully neutral. "He thinks you don't trust family anymore." The accusation stung because it was so unfair. I trusted them completely. I simply couldn't share operational details that could endanger missions or violate security protocols. I tried to explain this, but my father cut me off with his familiar dismissive wave, even over the phone. "We understand you have responsibilities," he said. "But family should come first." When I came home for a brief leave, James had new friends. They gathered at our parents' house frequently, a group I didn't recognize from his college or previous jobs. They dressed better than James could afford, drove cars that seemed expensive for people supposedly between opportunities. They talked constantly about money, about shortcuts, about people who'd made it big by being smart enough to see angles others missed. The ringleader was a man named Derek, maybe 30, with the kind of practice charm that made me instinctively cautious. He asked too many questions about my work, questions disguised as casual interest, but pointed enough to trigger my training. When I deflected, he smiled and changed the subject, but I caught him watching me with calculation in his eyes. "Your brothers told us all about your exciting career," Derek said during one gathering, his tone just friendly enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Sounds like you must see some interesting things." I gave him my standard response about routine administrative work, but he wasn't fooled. None of them were. They knew James's sister was in intelligence, and they were clearly interested in what that might mean for their undefined opportunities. James seemed different around these new friends, more confident but also more aggressive. He made jokes about my careful habits, my reluctance to discuss work, my inability to just relax and trust people. Once, I caught him going through my old bedroom, claiming he was looking for something our mother had asked him to find. When I questioned him, he got defensive, accusing me of being paranoid. "God, you really don't trust anyone anymore," he said, and his friends laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. I started locking my door when I visited home, securing the few personal items I kept there. It felt ridiculous, protecting myself from my own family, but something in James's behavior had shifted beyond simple resentment. He watched me now, cataloged my movements, asked questions about my schedule that felt less like brotherly interest and more like reconnaissance. My parents seemed oblivious to the change, or maybe they chose not to see it. They were charmed by Derek and his friends, impressed by their expensive clothes and confident talk about investment opportunities. When I expressed concerns about James's new associates, my mother dismissed them as jealousy. "You've always been protective of your brother," she said. "But he's an adult now. He needs to make his own choices." The irony was stunning. For years, they'd expected me to manage James's choices, to clean up his mistakes, to shield him from consequences. Now, when I sensed actual danger, they wanted me to step back and let him navigate alone. During my last night of that leave, Derek cornered me in the kitchen. The rest of the group was in the living room, but he'd engineered a moment of privacy with the skill of someone used to manipulating situations. "Your brother really looks up to you," he said, leaning against the counter with false casualness. "He talks about you all the time. Your success, your access to important information." "I'm just a paper pusher," I replied, the lie automatic after years of practice. Derek smiled, and I saw something predatory in his expression. "Of course you are. But even paper pushers sometimes see interesting papers, right?" The threat wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. He was letting me know that they'd identified me as a potential source, that they understood my relationship with James could be leveraged. I left the next morning without saying goodbye, a knot of unease settling in my stomach. Over the following months, James's texts became stranger. He'd sent photos of expensive dinners, new clothes, gadgets he couldn't afford on his sporadic employment income. When I asked about his finances, he gave vague answers about investments and opportunities paying off. My parents seemed proud of his sudden success, relieved that he was finally getting his life together. They didn't ask hard questions about where the money was coming from, just as they'd never asked hard questions about his behavior before. I started having dreams about classified documents scattered across Derek's expensive car, about James laughing while strangers photographed files marked with security classifications. I told myself it was paranoia, the occupational hazard of working in intelligence. James was irresponsible, not treasonous. But the dreams felt like warnings, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about danger. Something was building in the space between my family's expectations and my professional obligations, something that would force me to choose between protecting James and protecting everything I'd sworn to defend. I just didn't know how soon that choice would come, or how devastating it would be when it finally arrived. The mission lasted 3 months longer than originally planned. Extended operations always created a strange disconnect from normal life, a feeling of existing in 2 different worlds simultaneously. I carried out my duties with the precision my training demanded while part of my mind remained tethered to home, to family, to the ordinary concerns that suddenly seemed both trivial and impossibly important. When orders finally came through for my return, I felt the familiar mixture of relief and disorientation that marked the end of classified work. The transition from operational focus to civilian mindset required careful management, a deliberate shift from hypervigilance to something approaching normal human interaction. I drove straight from the airport to my parents' house. It was nearly midnight, but I needed to see them, to ground myself in family before dealing with the administrative requirements of my return. The house was lit up, unusual for that hour. My parents were typically in bed by 10, creatures of habit in almost everything. I parked on the street and walked toward the front door, keys in hand, planning to let myself in quietly and surprise them in the morning. But as I approached, I heard voices through the living room window. My parents were awake, and James was there, his laugh carrying that particular pitch of excitement he'd had since childhood when he thought he was being especially clever. I paused at the door, hand raised to knock, when his words stopped me cold. "She thinks she's safe now," he was saying, and something in his tone made me step back into the shadows. If she knew what we did behind her back. The laughter that followed wasn't the warm sound of family conversation. It was conspiratorial, gleeful, the sound of people sharing a secret they found amusing rather than troubling. My training kicked in automatically. I moved away from the door, positioning myself where I could hear clearly without being seen. My heart was beating hard enough that I was afraid they might hear it, but I needed to understand what I was listening to. "The files were exactly where you said they'd be," James continued. "In that locked drawer in her old room." Took me 3 tries to pick the lock, but Derek's friend knew exactly what to look for. My mother's voice, cautious, but not horrified. "You're sure she won't notice they're missing?" I photographed everything and put it all back exactly how I found it. "She's so paranoid about organization, she would have noticed if anything was out of place. But she never checks that drawer when she's here for short visits." My father, practical as always, and they paid what they promised. $50,000 cash. "Derek says there's more where that came from if we can get access to her current files." The stuff I found was old, but it gave them exactly what they needed to verify she has the kind of clearance they're interested in. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the porch railing to keep from falling, trying to process what I was hearing. James had broken into my personal files, stolen classified documents, sold them to strangers for money. And my parents not only knew about it, they were complicit. "I still think this is risky," my mother said, but her tone suggested concern about consequences rather than moral objection. "Only if she finds out," James replied. "And why would she? She trusts us completely. Always has. It's actually kind of pathetic how much she trusts us." Their laughter felt like physical blows. I thought about every time I defended James to supervisors who questioned my family connections during security reviews. Every time I'd vouched for his character, insisted that his immaturity was harmless, that he would never compromise my work or safety. "The next files will be worth even more," James was saying. "Derek has buyers lined up, people who pay serious money for current intelligence. All we need is access to her apartment, or her laptop, or even just information about her current assignment." "How do we get that?" my father asked. "Easy. She tells us everything eventually. She thinks she's being secretive, but she always drops enough details that we can figure out what she's working on. And if that doesn't work, Derek has other ideas." I backed away from the window, my legs shaking. I made it to my car before the full impact hit me. Not just the betrayal, though that was devastating enough. The operational security breach, the lives potentially endangered, the careers destroyed, including my own. The years of investigation that would follow, the suspicion that would attach to every assignment, every clearance review, every relationship I'd built in my professional life. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at my parents' house, trying to understand how I'd gotten here. How the people I'd protected my entire life had decided to exploit and endanger me for money. How my brother's resentment had evolved into something so toxic that he could laugh about selling my secrets to hostile buyers. My phone buzzed with a text from James. "Saw your car. Coming in or what?" I stared at the message, at the casual tone that suggested nothing had changed, that he expected me to walk through that door and continue pretending we were a normal family. He had no idea I'd heard him confessing to treason, that I knew exactly what kind of danger he'd created. I started the car and drove away without responding. I couldn't face them, not yet. Not until I decided what I was going to do with the knowledge that my own family had betrayed everything I'd sworn to protect. The safe house protocol existed for situations exactly like this, though I'd never imagined using it because of family rather than foreign operatives. I drove to the designated location, a nondescript apartment maintained for debriefing and emergency situations, and tried to think clearly about what I'd learned. The immediate priority was damage assessment. I needed to know exactly what James had accessed, what he'd sold, and who had bought it. Then I needed to trace the operational impact, which missions might be compromised, which assets might be at risk, which intelligence relationships might be damaged beyond repair. After that came the harder question: what to do about my family. I called my handler, Agent Michelle Chin, someone I'd worked with for 2 years and trusted completely. She answered on the second ring, despite the late hour, instantly alert when she heard my voice. "I need to report a security breach," I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. "Personal compartment, but with operational implications." "Are you secure?" she asked. "Yes. I'm at Safe House 7. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I spent those 30 minutes staring at my phone, at the text from James still waiting for a response. Part of me wanted to call him, to give him a chance to explain, to hope that somehow I'd misunderstood what I'd heard. But I knew better. The words had been too clear, too specific, too gleeful for misinterpretation. Michelle arrived with coffee and the kind of calm professionalism that made crisis management possible. I told her everything, from James's strange new friends to my parents' complicit laughter, from the security protocols he'd bypassed to the money he'd received for classified information. "Jesus," she said when I finished. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "Months, maybe longer." He had access to my room whenever I was deployed. I kept personal files there, thinking they were secure because... I stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Because you trusted your family," Michelle completed. "Which is exactly what you were supposed to do, according to every psychological profile and security assessment. Family trust isn't a vulnerability until someone exploits it." She was right, but that didn't make the betrayal hurt less. It didn't change the fact that my own judgment, my fundamental understanding of the people closest to me, had been catastrophically wrong. "What happens now?" I asked. "Investigation, obviously. We'll need to catalog exactly what was compromised and trace where it went. Counterintelligence will want to identify the buyers and assess what damage control is possible." She paused, studying my face. "And you'll need to decide how cooperative you want to be with the prosecution phase." The prosecution phase, where my brother would be arrested, charged with espionage, potentially sentenced to decades in federal prison. Where my parents would face charges as accessories, their comfortable retirement replaced by legal fees and social disgrace. "I don't have a choice," I said. "This isn't about family loyalty anymore. It's about national security." Michelle nodded, but I could see sympathy in her expression. She understood that doing the right thing would cost me everything I'd thought I had, that protecting my country meant destroying my family. "There is one other consideration," she said carefully. "James texted you. He expects you to come home. If you disappear suddenly, if you change your normal patterns, he might get spooked and run. Or worse, he might accelerate whatever timeline he and his buyers are operating on. You want me to pretend nothing happened? I want you to buy us time to build a comprehensive case. Go home. Act normal. Let him think you're still the trusting sister who doesn't suspect anything. Give us a chance to identify everyone involved and secure all the compromised material before they realize we're onto them." The thought of sitting across from James at the breakfast table, smiling while he planned to sell more of my secrets, made me physically sick. But I could see the operational logic. A premature confrontation would scatter the conspirators and leave us with partial information, incomplete justice. "How long?" I asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Just long enough to document the network and prepare for coordinated arrests. I looked at my phone again, at James's text still waiting for an answer. In a few hours, I'd have to walk through my parents' front door and hug the people who'd been laughing about my trust, my naivety, my pathetic loyalty to the family that had sold me for $50,000. But first, I had to accept a truth that was rewriting everything I'd believed about love and loyalty and the people who were supposed to protect you instead of exploiting you. My family had declared war on everything I represented, and I was going to have to fight back. I finally responded to James's text. Sorry, got called away. See you in the morning. The lie came easier than I'd expected. Maybe because I was finally learning to speak his language. I spent the night at the safe house, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard James's voice describing how pathetic my trust was, how easy it had been to violate my security and sell my secrets. I thought about all the times I'd defended him to colleagues who'd questioned my family connections during clearance reviews, all the times I'd insisted that his irresponsibility was harmless. Michelle returned at dawn with a full operational briefing. Counterintelligence had been busy overnight, cross-referencing James's new associates with known hostile contacts and money laundering networks. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd feared. Derek wasn't just an opportunistic criminal looking for quick cash from stolen documents. He was a sophisticated operative with connections to foreign intelligence services, someone who specialized in recruiting assets with access to classified information. James hadn't stumbled into espionage. He'd been deliberately cultivated, his resentments and financial needs carefully exploited by professionals who understood exactly how to turn family loyalty into a weapon. The buyers aren't just paying for your files, Michelle explained. They're paying to develop you as a long-term source. The plan was to gradually increase James's financial dependence on these sales, then use that leverage to pressure you into more active cooperation. Blackmail, I said. Eventually, yes. Start with your brother's willing cooperation, then transition to threats against him if he didn't provide better access to current operations. Classic recruitment pattern. The sophistication of it was almost impressive. Derek and his handlers had identified my protective instincts toward James as my primary vulnerability, then systematically exploited that weakness. They understood that I'd sacrifice almost anything to keep my brother safe, including potentially my oath and my country. They just hadn't counted on me discovering the operation before they were ready to spring the trap. Michelle handed me a communication device disguised as a fitness tracker. Audio and video recording capability, encrypted transmission directly to our servers. We need documentation of everything: conversations, meetings, financial transactions, anything that establishes the scope of the conspiracy. The device felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the knowledge of what I was about to do. I was going to record my own family confessing to treason, building the case that would send them to federal prison. Are you sure you can handle this? Michelle asked. Nobody would blame you for stepping back and letting us take it from here. I thought about the operational security protocols I'd sworn to uphold, about the lives that depended on classified information staying classified. I thought about other young intelligence officers who might face the same recruitment pressure if this network wasn't completely dismantled. I can handle it, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. I drove to my parents' house as the sun was rising, practicing normal expressions in the rearview mirror. I needed to be the loyal daughter, the protective sister, the trusting family member who'd never suspect her loved ones of betrayal. James opened the door before I could knock, his smile genuine enough to make my heart ache. For just a moment, I could see the little boy who'd looked up to me, who'd depended on me, who'd once been proud to call me his big sister. There she is, he said, pulling me into a hug that felt like mockery now that I knew what he really thought of me. Mom's making your favorite pancakes. She's been up since 5, so excited to see you. My parents were indeed excited, fussing over me with an attention that felt both familiar and utterly wrong. They asked about my trip, carefully avoiding any questions that might touch on classified information. They seemed genuinely happy to have me home, genuinely loving in their behavior. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were the same people who'd laughed about exploiting my trust 12 hours earlier, but their affection seemed real. Either they were better actors than I'd given them credit for, or they'd found a way to compartmentalize their betrayal as somehow separate from their love. James has some exciting news, my mother said over breakfast, her voice bright with pride. I looked at my brother, forcing curiosity into my expression instead of the revulsion I felt. Oh, I got into a new business venture, James said, and I could hear the careful rehearsal in his words. Investment consulting. Turns out I have a knack for identifying valuable information and connecting it with the right buyers. The audacity was breathtaking. He was describing espionage in terms that made it sound like legitimate commerce, and my parents were buying it completely. That's wonderful, I said, activating the recording device with a gesture that looked like adjusting my watch. Tell me more about it. For the next hour, James detailed his business with an enthusiasm that made my stomach turn. He talked about his partnerships, his clients, his plans for expansion. He never used words like classified or stolen, but the substance was clear enough for anyone who understood the context. My parents asked supportive questions, offered advice about managing his newfound success, suggested ways he could invest his profits. They were proud of him, relieved that he'd finally found something he was good at, completely oblivious to the federal crimes they were discussing over pancakes and coffee. When James stepped outside to take a phone call, my mother leaned across the table with conspiratorial excitement. "He's making more money than he's ever made in his life," she whispered. "Enough to pay off his student loans, maybe even buy a house. And it's all legitimate business, using his natural charm and connections." I nodded and smiled, wondering how she'd convinced herself that James's natural charm and connections had suddenly become valuable enough to generate the kind of money he was spending. The willful ignorance was almost as disturbing as the active betrayal. James returned with news that Derek wanted to meet with him that afternoon. "Big potential client," he explained. "Could be worth 6 figures if I handle it right." "That's amazing," I said, though what I was thinking was that this might be the break Michelle needed to identify the buyers. "Where are you meeting?" "Downtown, at that new restaurant on 5th Street. Derek likes to conduct business over good food." James paused, studying my face. "You should come with me. Meet Derek, see what I'm building here. I think you'd be impressed." The invitation was clearly calculated. Derek wanted to assess me directly, to begin the process of drawing me into their operation. But it was also an opportunity to gather intelligence about their network, to identify their methods and contacts. "I'd love to," I said, meaning it for entirely different reasons than James assumed. That afternoon, I sat across from Derek at an expensive restaurant, watching him deploy the kind of practice charm that had clearly worked on my brother. He was smooth, confident, asking just the right questions to seem interested in my career without appearing to pry. He talked about the importance of family, about how proud James was of his successful sister, about how rare it was to find people you could really trust. "Your brother tells me you work for the government," Derek said, his tone casually interested. "Nothing too exciting," I replied, giving him the same deflection I'd used for years. "Administrative work, mostly. Lots of paperwork." Derek smiled, and I saw the predator behind the charm. Paperwork can be very valuable in the right hands. Information is the most precious commodity in today's world. He was testing me, seeing how I'd respond to a direct reference to information trading. I played confused, slightly uncomfortable, the reaction he'd expect from someone who hadn't yet been recruited but might be open to persuasion. James jumped in, laughing off Derek's comment as theoretical business philosophy. But I could see the calculation in both their eyes, the way they were measuring my reactions and planning their next moves. By the time we left the restaurant, I had enough recorded evidence to document the recruitment attempt. Derek had been careful not to say anything explicitly illegal, but the subtext was clear enough to support Michelle's assessment of their operation. That evening, James walked me to my car with the kind of brotherly concern that would have touched me if I didn't know what it was really about. "Derek likes you," he said. "He thinks you're smart, discreet. The kind of person who understands that opportunities don't come along every day." "What kind of opportunities?" I asked, playing naive. James looked around, making sure we weren't overheard. "The kind that could set us both up for life. But they require trust, family loyalty." "Are you someone who can keep family secrets?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications. He was asking if I'd be willing to commit treason for money, framing it as family loyalty rather than betrayal of everything I'd sworn to protect. Family comes first, I said, echoing the phrase our parents had taught us both. Always. James smiled, and for a moment he looked like the little brother I'd once protected from everything. That's what I told Derek. That's exactly what I told him. I drove away knowing that the trap was closing around all of us. James and his handlers thought they were reeling in a valuable asset, while I was building the case that would destroy them. We were all lying to each other now, all pretending to be people we weren't, all preparing for a confrontation that only one side saw coming. But as I reported in to Michelle that night, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in me during those conversations. The grief and shock were still there, but they were being overtaken by something colder, more focused. James had spent months laughing about my trust, my loyalty, my pathetic devotion to family. He'd sold my secrets and planned to sell more, endangered my life and career for money he'd spent on expensive dinners and designer clothes. He'd underestimated me completely, assumed that my love for him would make me weak rather than dangerous. But he was about to learn that the same protective instincts that had shielded him for years could be turned in other directions, toward other loyalties that mattered more than family ties. I was done protecting James from consequences. It was time for him to face what he'd chosen, what he'd become, what he'd done to the people who'd loved him most. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within a week, counterintelligence had identified the entire network, Derek's handlers, the foreign buyers, the money laundering operations, even secondary assets who'd been developed using similar family exploitation tactics. The scope was staggering, but so was the operational security failure that James had created by stealing my files. Michelle briefed me on the damage assessment over secure communication. 3 ongoing operations had been compromised, requiring the extraction of assets whose lives were now in danger. 2 intelligence sharing agreements with allied services were under review. My own security clearance was suspended pending investigation, effectively ending my career in intelligence work. The good news is that we caught it before the really sensitive material was compromised, Michelle said, though her expression suggested the good news was limited. The files James stole were personal documentation, not current operational intelligence. But they gave the buyers enough information to target other assets in your network. I absorbed this quietly, understanding that my brother's greed had created ripple effects that would take years to fully address. People I'd worked with, trusted colleagues and sources, were now under suspicion or active threat because of information James had sold for pocket money. What about prosecution? I asked. Federal prosecutors are building cases against everyone we've identified. James will face espionage charges, your parents will likely be charged as accessories, and Derek's entire network is looking at decades in federal prison. She paused. Your cooperation has been essential, but I need to warn you about what comes next. The trial phase would require me to testify against my own family, to present the evidence I'd gathered during those horrible weeks of pretending everything was normal. My recordings, my documentation of their conversations and plans, would form the backbone of the prosecution's case. They'll argue that you entrapped them, Michelle continued. That you violated family trust by recording private conversations. Their lawyers will try to paint you as the real betrayer, the cold government agent who destroyed her family for career advancement. I'd already thought about this, about how it would feel to sit in a courtroom while defense lawyers portrayed my loyalty to my oath as disloyalty to my blood. But I'd also thought about the assets who'd been extracted under emergency conditions, the operations that had been blown, the years of work that had been compromised for $50,000 and the promise of more. When do the arrests happen? I asked. Tomorrow morning. Coordinated takedowns at 6 a.m. We need you to be somewhere visible but neutral when it happens, not at your parents' house, not at your apartment. Somewhere you'd naturally be if you had no idea what was coming. I chose the gym where I'd been working out since high school, a public place with security cameras that would document my location when the arrests occurred. I needed an alibi that showed I was living my normal life, not orchestrating my family's destruction. The call came at 6:47 a.m. while I was on the treadmill. My mother's voice was barely recognizable through her tears and panic. They took James, she sobbed. Men with badges, they said he was under arrest for espionage. They're searching the house, going through everything. Your father. Her voice broke completely. I stopped running, letting genuine shock color my voice. What? Mom, slow down. What are you talking about? Federal agents. They have a warrant. They're saying James sold classified information, that he's a spy. The words came out in a rush, barely coherent. They asked about you, about your job, about files you might have kept at home. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, though whether from adrenaline or relief or simple exhaustion, I couldn't tell. I'm coming over, I said. No, don't. They told us not to contact you, said it might interfere with their investigation. But I had to call, had to warn you that they might come for you too. The irony was devastating. My mother was trying to protect me from an investigation I'd initiated, warning me about consequences I'd helped set in motion. Even now, believing her son had committed treason, she was more concerned about my safety than his guilt. I drove to their house anyway, arriving to find it surrounded by official vehicles and crime scene tape. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching federal agents carry boxes of evidence from the home where I'd grown up. My parents sat in the back of a bureau car, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen them. Agent Chin met me at the perimeter, her expression professionally neutral. Ms. Sandberry, we'll need to interview you as part of this investigation. Standard procedure when family members have security clearance. I nodded, playing the confused sister rather than the cooperating witness. I don't understand what's happening. James wouldn't. He's not a spy. We'll sort it all out, Michelle said, and I heard the double meaning meant only for me. But right now, we need you to stay away from the scene while we process evidence. I spent the day at a coffee shop downtown, fielding calls from relatives who'd seen the news coverage. The story was already public. Local man arrested in espionage ring, complete with photos of James being led away in handcuffs. The reports described a sophisticated operation selling classified documents to foreign buyers, but they didn't mention my role in the investigation. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from extended family, college friends, former colleagues who'd seen my name mentioned in connection with the case. Everyone wanted to know if I was okay, if I needed support, if the charges against my brother were really true. I replied with carefully neutral responses, expressing shock and confusion while avoiding any details about the investigation. It felt like performing grief for an audience that couldn't see my face, maintaining a role even when the cameras were off. That evening, my parents were released without charges, though the investigation was ongoing. They came to my apartment looking destroyed, aged years in a single day. My father, usually so controlled, couldn't stop his hands from shaking. My mother had cried until she had no tears left, her eyes red and swollen. They showed us recordings, my mother said, her voice barely a whisper. James talking about selling information, planning to get access to your files. We didn't know, I swear we didn't know it was that serious. The lie came so naturally, I almost believed it myself. My parents had known exactly what James was doing, had been complicit in planning to exploit my security clearance. But faced with federal charges and the collapse of their comfortable life, they were rewriting history to minimize their involvement. The lawyer says James might plead guilty, my father said. 20 years minimum if he cooperates with the investigation. 20 years. I made appropriate sounds of shock and sympathy, holding my mother while she cried about her baby boy, her youngest child who'd made one terrible mistake. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, comforting the people who'd betrayed me while they mourned the consequences of their betrayal. They asked about you, my mother continued. Whether you knew what James was doing, whether you helped him access classified information. We told them no, of course, but they seemed suspicious. Why would they be suspicious? I asked. Family loyalty, my father said bitterly. They think family members always protect each other, even when they're doing wrong. They can't understand that you'd be as shocked as anyone by what James did. The statement hung in the air, loaded with assumptions about my character and choices. My parents believed I would naturally protect James, that discovering his espionage would create a conflict between my oath and my family that I'd resolve in favor of blood ties. They had no idea that I'd already resolved that conflict in the opposite direction, that I'd chosen duty over family and helped build the case that would send their son to federal prison. Over the following weeks, the investigation expanded to include Derek's entire network. More arrests, more evidence, more revelations about the scope of the operation. The media coverage was relentless, turning our family drama into a public spectacle about loyalty, betrayal, and national security. James's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month. Federal prosecutors had offered him a plea deal, 15 years in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against the other defendants. His lawyer was recommending he take it, but James was still hoping for some kind of miracle that would restore his freedom. My parents visited him in federal detention, returning each time more devastated than before. He was maintaining his innocence to them, claiming he'd been tricked by Derek into a legal activity he hadn't understood. He insisted that his sister would never let him go to prison for a mistake, that I'd find some way to help him. He keeps asking about you, my mother told me after one visit. Asking why you haven't come to see him, why you haven't tried to help with his legal fees. He doesn't understand why you're not fighting for him. The question implied criticism, the suggestion that my absence from James's defense proved something negative about my character. I could see doubt growing in my parents' eyes, uncertainty about why their loyal daughter wasn't moving heaven and earth to protect their son. I've been suspended from work pending investigation, I said, which was true. I can't afford legal fees any more than you can. But you have connections, my father pressed. People in the government who could explain that James is just a kid who got in over his head. Surely someone would listen to you. They still didn't understand. They thought this was a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with the right conversation, the right explanation, the right appeal to bureaucratic sympathy. They couldn't grasp that James had committed serious federal crimes or that my connections made me less able to help him, not more. 3 weeks after the arrests, James finally asked to see me. The request came through his lawyer, who suggested that a family meeting might help convince him to accept the plea deal. I agreed, knowing that this conversation would likely be our last as brother and sister. The federal detention center was exactly as grim as I'd expected. James looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, younger somehow, like the little boy I'd once protected from playground bullies and failed tests. But when he spoke, the entitled arrogance was still there, barely concealed beneath surface remorse. I knew you'd come, he said, reaching across the table as if to take my hand. I told everyone you wouldn't abandon me. I kept my hands in my lap, watching his expression shift from relief to confusion. I'm here because your lawyer asked me to come. He thinks I might convince you to take the plea deal. Plea deal. James laughed, but there was desperation in it. I'm not pleading guilty to espionage. This whole thing is insane. Derek set me up, used me to get to you. I'm a victim here, not a criminal. The revision of history was breathtaking. James had gone from bragging about his successful business venture to claiming he'd been manipulated by sophisticated criminals. He'd forgotten that I'd heard him laugh about my trust, joke about exploiting my security clearance, plan to sell more of my secrets for better money. You sold classified documents, I said quietly. You broke into my personal files and sold them to foreign buyers. That's not being victimized, that's committing espionage. James stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. Those weren't real secrets. Just old stuff you kept in your room, probably not even important. And I needed the money, you know how much debt I'm carrying. Need doesn't justify treason. Treason? His voice rose, drawing attention from other visitors. Jesus, you sound like them. Like the prosecutors. I thought you'd understand, thought you'd have my back like you always have. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw someone I didn't recognize. The protective love I'd carried for him my entire life was gone, replaced by something colder and more final. He'd betrayed everything I valued, endangered people I'd worked with, destroyed my career, all for money he'd already spent on expensive meals and designer clothes. I can't have your back this time, I said. Not when you're wrong. Not when you've done something this damaging. James leaned back in his chair, studying my face with growing alarm. You're not going to help me. I'm going to testify against you. The words hung between us like a physical barrier. James's expression went through several transformations: disbelief, anger, betrayal, finally settling on something that looked almost like hatred. "You're choosing them over me," he said. "Your job over your family. I'm choosing right over wrong. Something you apparently can't do. I'm your brother. You were my brother. Brothers don't sell their sisters' secrets to enemy agents for pocket money." I stood to leave, but James grabbed my wrist across the table. "You'll destroy Mom and Dad too. They're already falling apart. If you testify against me, it'll kill them. You should have thought about that before you committed espionage. Please." The word came out broken, desperate. "I'll take the plea deal, I'll cooperate, I'll do whatever they want. Just don't testify against me. Don't be the one who sends me to prison." For a moment, looking at his terrified face, I felt an echo of the protective instinct that had defined our relationship for so many years. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to find some way to minimize his consequences, to shield him from the full weight of what he'd chosen. But I thought about the assets who'd been evacuated because of his betrayal, the operations that had been blown, the years of careful work that had been destroyed for money he'd already spent. I thought about other young intelligence officers who might face similar recruitment attempts, who deserved to know that betrayal had consequences. "You sent yourself to prison the moment you decided my secrets were for sale," I said. "I'm just making sure justice gets done." I left him crying in that gray room, small and alone, and finally understanding that his actions had consequences he couldn't charm or manipulate his way out of. It was the last time I saw James as anything other than a defendant in a federal espionage case. The trial phase stretched over 6 months, dominating local news and attracting national attention as a cautionary tale about family loyalty and national security. I testified for 3 days, presenting the evidence I'd gathered and answering questions about my brother's recruitment and betrayal. James's defense attorney did exactly what Michelle had predicted, painting me as the real villain in the story. I was the cold government agent who'd chosen career advancement over family loyalty, who'd betrayed the people who loved me most for bureaucratic approval. I was the sister who'd worn a wire to record private family conversations, who'd built a case against my own brother using his trust in me as evidence against him. The strategy might have worked if the evidence hadn't been so overwhelming. James had sold classified documents to foreign buyers, planned to sell more, and laughed about exploiting his sister's security clearance. No amount of character assassination could change those fundamental facts. My parents sat in the courtroom every day, looking older and more broken with each revelation. They still couldn't understand how their son had gone from family disappointment to federal criminal, how their daughter had gone from protective sister to prosecution witness. During my testimony, my mother cried quietly in the gallery while my father stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, certainly. Betrayal, probably. But also something that might have been recognition. The understanding that I'd become someone they didn't know, someone whose loyalty extended beyond family to principles they couldn't or wouldn't share. James was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Derek received 25 years. The foreign buyers would be tried separately, though most had already fled the country. My parents were charged with accessory after the fact, but received probation and community service in exchange for cooperation. I attended James's sentencing, but didn't speak to him afterward. There was nothing left to say, no relationship to salvage or repair. He'd made his choices, I'd made mine, and we'd both have to live with the consequences. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like a chronic illness rather than an acute injury. My security clearance was permanently revoked, ending any possibility of returning to intelligence work. The Bureau offered me a position in white-collar crime investigation, but I declined. I needed distance from government service, space to rebuild my professional identity around something other than secrets and national security. I took a job with a private security firm, using my analytical skills and attention to detail in corporate investigations rather than espionage cases. The work was satisfying in its own way, though it lacked the sense of larger purpose that had drawn me to intelligence in the first place. My parents struggled with their new reality. Their comfortable retirement was consumed by legal fees and social ostracism. Friends stopped calling, neighbors avoided eye contact, and the reputation they'd spent a lifetime building was destroyed by association with their son's crimes. They blamed me, of course. Not openly, but in small ways that accumulated over time. They'd mentioned James's letters from prison, his reports of poor conditions and dangerous inmates, his pleas for family support that went unanswered. They'd talk about other families who'd stood by their children despite legal troubles, who'd prioritized blood over principle. The criticism was implicit but constant. A good daughter would have found some way to protect her brother, would have minimized his consequences, would have chosen family loyalty over abstract concepts like justice and duty. I stopped visiting regularly, then stopped visiting at all. The conversations were too painful, too loaded with resentment and incomprehension. My parents couldn't forgive me for choosing duty over family, and I couldn't forgive them for enabling James's betrayal in the first place. The silence stretched into months, then years. I sent cards on birthdays and holidays, but received no response. Mutual relatives reported that my parents were getting older, that my father's health was declining, that they asked about me sometimes, but never directly requested contact. I told myself I didn't care, that I'd made peace with the choices I'd faced and the prices I'd paid. But in quiet moments, usually late at night when the distractions of work and routine couldn't quite fill the space where family used to be, I felt the weight of being alone in the world by choice rather than circumstance. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from James. It arrived at my office, forwarded through several addresses, written in the careful handwriting of someone with too much time to think. He was up for parole review, he said, and wanted to apologize for what he'd put me through. He understood now that he'd been wrong, that his actions had consequences beyond his own life, that I'd done what I thought was right even though it had cost us our relationship. The letter sounded sincere, though I couldn't tell if the sincerity came from genuine remorse or from the kind of calculation that comes with facing a parole board. James had always been good with words, skilled at saying what people wanted to hear. Prison might have changed him, but it also might have simply given him more time to perfect his manipulations. I didn't respond to the letter, though I kept it. Some part of me wanted to believe that my brother had finally learned something from his consequences, that the 18-year-old boy who'd once looked up to me still existed somewhere beneath the man who'd sold my secrets for pocket money. But belief required trust, and trust required evidence I didn't have. James could write beautiful letters about remorse and redemption, but words were easy from a prison cell. The test would come when he was released, when he faced real choices about how to rebuild his life. I hoped he'd learned something from his consequences. I hoped prison had taught him that actions have prices, that loyalty is earned rather than assumed, that family doesn't excuse betrayal. But I wasn't going to wait around to find out. 8 years after James's conviction, I received a call that my father had suffered a massive heart attack. He was in intensive care, not expected to survive, and my mother was asking for me to come home. The message came through my cousin Maria, the only family member who'd maintained contact with both sides of our fractured relationship. "She needs you," Maria said. "Whatever happened between you all, she's going to be alone now. And she's too proud to ask directly." I sat in my apartment, looking out at a city that had become more home than the place where I'd grown up, trying to decide whether I owed anything to the woman who'd laughed about my trust being pathetic. My father was dying, and my mother would soon be a widow with a son in federal prison and a daughter who'd chosen principle over family. The practical part of me said I had no obligations here, that I'd paid enough prices for other people's choices. But the part of me that had once believed family meant everything couldn't quite let go of the idea that some bonds transcend betrayal, that some relationships deserve one more chance even when they don't deserve forgiveness. I took leave from work and drove home for the first time in 8 years. My father was unconscious when I arrived at the hospital, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with artificial life. He looked smaller than I remembered, grayer and more fragile, like someone who'd carried too much weight for too long. My mother sat beside his bed, holding his hand and looking every day of her 73 years. She glanced up when I entered the room, and I saw surprise followed by something that might have been relief. "You came," she said. "Maria called. I didn't think you would. After everything." I sat down across from her, the hospital bed creating a safe distance between us. "How long has he been like this?" "Since yesterday morning. They say his heart is too damaged to recover. It's just a matter of time now." We sat in silence for a while, watching machines keep my father alive while his body slowly gave up the fight. I thought about the last conversation we'd had 8 years earlier when he'd asked me to use my government connections to help James. I thought about all the conversations we'd never have now, all the chances for understanding or reconciliation that had passed while we were both too proud or too hurt to reach out. He talked about you, my mother said finally. Especially after James was sent away. He understood why you did what you did, even if he couldn't say so at the time. Did he? You were always his favorite, you know. He was so proud when you joined the government, when you got your security clearance. He bragged to everyone about his daughter, who worked in intelligence. She paused, her voice breaking slightly. It broke his heart when everything fell apart. I absorbed this information without comment. My father's pride in my career hadn't stopped him from being complicit in James's plan to exploit it, hadn't made him object when my brother laughed about selling my secrets. But maybe that was the kind of contradiction that defined most families, love and betrayal existing simultaneously, people hurting the ones they cared about most because they thought love made anything forgivable. James wrote to you, my mother continued. He said you never responded. No, I didn't. He's getting out next year. Early release for good behavior. The news shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. Somehow I'd imagined James serving his full sentence, remaining safely contained in federal prison where his choices couldn't affect anyone else. The idea of him walking free, returning to a world where he could make new mistakes and hurt new people, was more disturbing than I'd expected. What will he do? I asked. I don't know. He can't live with me. The terms of his parole won't allow it because of my involvement in the case. He'll have to find his own place, his own job. Start over completely. My father died 3 days later, quietly in his sleep while my mother and I kept vigil beside his bed. I helped plan the funeral, handled the administrative details that grief makes impossible, provided the kind of practical support that didn't require emotional reconciliation. The service was small, attended mostly by elderly relatives and a few longtime family friends. James was denied compassionate release to attend, which meant my mother buried her husband without her son present. I stood beside her at the graveside, offering what comfort I could to the woman who'd once betrayed me, finding that love and resentment could coexist more easily than I'd imagined. After the funeral, my mother and I sat in the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by the accumulated possessions of a 40-year marriage. She seemed lost without my father's presence, uncertain how to navigate the practical realities of widowhood. I know you'll never forgive us, she said as I prepared to leave. What we did to you, what we cost you. I know it was unforgivable. I thought about forgiveness, about whether it was something you chose or something that happened to you, about whether understanding someone's motivations made their actions less damaging. I don't know about forgiveness, I said finally. But I understand why you protected him. I spent most of my life doing the same thing. You were a better sister than he deserved. Maybe. Or maybe I enabled him until he thought he could get away with anything, including treason. My mother cried then, the kind of deep, body-shaking sobs that come from years of accumulated grief and regret. I held her the way I'd held James when he was small and frightened, the way I'd held my parents when they were arrested and confused, the way family members hold each other when the world becomes too much to bear alone. But holding someone isn't the same as trusting them, and comfort isn't the same as reconciliation. When my mother had cried herself out, when she was calm enough to manage on her own, I gathered my things and prepared to return to the life I'd built in the aftermath of betrayal. Will you stay in touch? She asked as I loaded my car. I'll call, I promised. Check on you. Make sure you're okay. But I can't come back to this. I can't pretend we're the same family we were before James sold my secrets. She nodded, accepting limitations she couldn't change. What about when he gets out? Will you see him then? I thought about my brother, about the man who'd laughed about exploiting my trust, who'd endangered my life and career for $50,000, who'd written beautiful letters about remorse from the safety of a prison cell. I don't know, I said, and realized that was the most honest answer I could give. I drove away from my childhood home for what I suspected would be the last time, carrying with me the complicated weight of love and loss, loyalty and betrayal, family and duty. The choices I'd made had prices I was still paying, would always pay, but they were choices I could live with. My brother would be released soon, would have to build a new life with the permanent mark of federal conviction. My mother would grow old alone, missing her husband and her son and the daughter who'd chosen principle over family. I would continue in the career I'd built from the wreckage of the one I'd lost, successful but solitary, respected but not quite trusted. We'd all learned that betrayal has consequences, that loyalty has limits, that love doesn't excuse everything. The lessons had cost us more than any of us had imagined when the choices were theoretical rather than immediate. But some prices are worth paying for the privilege of looking yourself in the mirror without shame, of knowing that when the world demanded you choose between right and easy, you chose right. Even when it meant standing alone. Even when it cost you everything. Even when the people you'd protected your whole life turned out to be the ones you needed protection from. In the end, I learned that real loyalty isn't about blood or blind devotion. It's about protecting what matters most, even when doing so breaks your heart. It's about standing up for principles that exist beyond personal convenience, beyond family comfort, beyond the easy path of looking the other way. My brother taught me that lesson in the cruelest way possible, by forcing me to choose between protecting him and protecting everything I'd sworn to defend. I chose duty over blood, justice over family, truth over the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about unconditional love. It was the hardest choice I'd ever made, and the only choice I could live with. The price was everything I thought I had. The reward was everything I knew I was. And that's how I learned the hardest truth. Sometimes the people you protect are the ones you need protection from. What would you have done in my place? Turned them in, or tried to keep the family secret? Do you believe betrayal by family hurts more than betrayal by friends or coworkers? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd handle it. And if you've ever had to choose between loyalty and self-respect, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, justice, and reclaiming your worth. Because at the end of the day, trust has to be earned.